welcome to Personal Landscapes. I'm your host, Brian Murdoch. You can find links for today's episode and other conversations on Books About Place at brianmurdoch.com. The legendary travel presenter and Monty Python alumni Michael Palin has said, "It remains for me the quintessential travel publisher." It has one of the very best lists, according to historian William Dalrymple. The writer Fergus Fleming says, "No British publisher has a list so enticingly eclectic or so consistently rewarding." I'm speaking, of course, about the legendary Eland books. Eland has been resurrecting lost travel classics and keeping them in print for more than 35 years. Joining me today from London is Barnaby Rogerson, publisher of Eland and a prolific writer on the Muslim world. I think it's a perfect place to kick off my very first podcast and any discussion on Books About Place. We talk about Anthropology-lite, why the post-war period was a golden age for British travel writing, and why some of the 20th century's most exciting writers were autodidacts. You'll want to have a pencil and notebook handy for this one. There are so many books that you'll want to read. Barnaby Rogerson, welcome to Personal Landscapes.
Thank you for inviting me.
I think as I'm an enormous fan of your work, as you know, and I think Eland is the obvious place to start my new podcast about Books About Place. I think many of my listeners will already know Eland or be familiar with Eland books, but for those who don't, could you please tell us the story of Eland and how you came to the helm of this venerable institution?
Absolutely. Eland is a publishing company with quite a well-placed niche in reprinting classic travel literature. And we've got good coverage in the trade in Britain. People know us. We're almost cited as an example of how to do independent publishing, just concentrate on your niche. But yet, at the same time, we're an oddball operation. We don't feel part of the mainstream in any way. We're very anti-corporate. And there's a sort of enduring sort of amateur bohemian edge to it all right from the start. So this is not just me sounding off. Eland got started because there was a character called John Hatt who was working as a journalist in Southeast Asia. And he discovered this amazing book called A Dragon Apparent by Norman Lewis, which predicted the fall of the French regime in Southeast Asia and in a way predicted the final disaster of American involvement in that region. And he was so taken by this book. And he said, everybody needs to read it. Everybody should have a copy of this. So he went around all the London publishing companies saying, you've just got to reprint it. It's absolutely a vital part of contemporary sort of life. And they all rejected it. And so he said, bugger that, I'm going to set up on my own. And it was his desire to sort of sidestep the sort of corporate control that Eland was born with a very single book, A Dragon Apparent by Norman Lewis. And John Hatt, in order to sort of give it body, started adding others and did 4 books that first March 1982, and then rolled it on, but always keeping away from setting up an office, getting investors, running it from the top of his house, and very sort of hands-on attitude. And quite early on, I wrote him a fan letter. I'm afraid in purple ink, as still am, of a pretentious, affected character. And I'd read all the books he'd reprinted about Morocco, which I knew as a young man. And I wrote as a student, sort of, I suppose, feeling my way towards a job. And he wrote back very kindly saying, I'm never going to employ anybody who writes to me in purple ink. But I'm intrigued by your interest. And so come and have a cup of tea on the understanding that this is not a job interview. So we had a really good chat and we stayed in contact. And later on, I quite soon became a writer of guidebooks to North Africa, Turkey and the Middle East, and would recommend books to him. And he behaved just as badly as the corporate culture in rejecting our advice. But we sort of got to know him very well, sort of working beside him.
And how did you end up taking it over?
Some of these books that he'd refused, a bit like him, I said, well, bugger that. I'm going to reprint them myself. And so very much in the image of him, did 4 books in our first year and wrote a letter, I think wisely avoiding purple ink this time, and said, you could be annoyed because we are setting up very much in the slipstream of what you've done in Eland, but you can't be because I've tried to sell you these books. And so we're just going to go ahead. And he wrote back again, very good correspondent by return of post, saying you didn't need to have sent that letter. But I think it's going to be to your advantage because I'm looking for someone to take over Eland. He just made an enormous amount of money setting up cheapflights.com, which did make him a fortune, but nearly destroyed him, nearly gave him a stroke and a heart attack. And so he was bailing out. And at that stage of his life, he wanted to bail out of everything and take some time off and listen to birdsong at dawn and that sort of thing. I mean, I think if he'd held his hand, he'd have had all the money to run Eland, and because cheapflights.com sold very, very well. But so we took over with very little knowledge of anything apart from enthusiasm about these books that really, in a very chatty, loose, easy way, explained place to you, not guidebooks, much more fluent, narrative written sort of books by chance, as it were.
Well, yeah, in many ways, I see Eland as kind of a successor of those classic lists, like Century Traveler or Virago Travelers.
Just without sounding a bit nerdy, Eland started first, and it was John's success, and particularly in review coverage. He got some really good early coverage. We've kept scrapbooks with them, the physical articles pasted in, and literally some wise, clever publishers thought this man is just ahead of the wave and threw the bigger weight of corporate publishing behind. So Century happened after John, and they employed someone to quickly look at 100 and just sort of scoop them up, which John was sort of not cross about, but just, if you're a small business and you've got a good idea, you really need to go with it hammer and tongs. And to a certain extent, he felt a little bit scalped, as Virago's slightly different story because they were doing female writers and letters, and then added a travel dimension to it. And then I've been trying to research the history of the Penguin travel list, the early purple ones your readers will know all about in the 20s, which by and large aren't very good. Only 2 or 3 of them have survived of the 60. But the Penguin modern travel library with that recognizable sort of pale green spine was set up afterwards. And again, very ad hoc. I managed to talk to 2 or 3 people who were working at Penguin. He just said, we just rummaged around and saw which ones we had in print already, and we just repackaged them. And again, not a grand strategy. And I said, was there a travel editorial meeting? Was there a sort of think tank of informed writers? He said, no. She was the secretary who then, worked her way up. And she said, no, it was just a very informal sort of rearrangement. And of course, it sort of died out.
Yeah, but that's the thing. They're not around anymore, and you are clearly thriving. And I was always curious about how those started. I didn't realize there was so little coordination behind the scenes, that it was this that it was this improvised.
And what's encouraging is I've met some of the characters who were the sort of, whether it's this overworked secretary in Penguin or whether it was a freelance writer who's employed by Century to list his favorite 100 books. It's again down to a tiny few individuals with taste and discretion. Perhaps discretion is pompous, but who knew enough. And I rather love that. Although it's these big corporate machines, in the end, they're employing someone who's quite quirky to make up their mind for them. And when we were setting up Sickle Moon, we did, we talked to publishers rather foolishly because you've got to be a bit like a poker player, we now realize in retrospect. And we'd set off various other people, including John Murray, who suddenly thought, God, perhaps we should be setting up our own travel list. And he employed Sarah Anderson, who ran the iconic travel bookshop in Notting Hill, who's a great friend of ours. And she, we paid a couple of £100 to produce a dozen classics from the John Murray backlist, which he did and set it up. And then that went down the spout because he sold the whole business. But I love all these sort of interlaying of these few rare characters who are behind all of these different lists.
Do you think that's a reflection of Eland Readers as well? I mean, they seem to have that sort of quirky appreciation for some of these strange books and a radar for kind of finding this stuff.
Oh, very much. We've my wife, business partner, speaks Russian and wrote Russian travel guides, and we did books to Istanbul, and I know the Middle East and North Africa reasonably well as a tourist. So that was our area, and we soon sort of gutted the ones that were very fluent from those regions. And we've turned ourselves, without any organization, into a cooperative of passionate readers. We get lots of emails, sometimes 2 or 3 a day, from customers and clients talking about books they've liked. And sometimes someone's, said, I've read Peking Story, I've read Hermit of Peking. Why haven't you done ... And then we pay attention because they've already read into what we're up to. And literally, I think probably about half our titles now have been selected, or I've been urged to read a book by a reader, client, customer, whatever it is, fellow traveler.
So what were some of your best finds that came from readers?
Well, to give you the most extreme example, I knew this Kyrus character, sort of on one level, sort of ascetic Marquis in Northern Ireland, who had an early art gallery in London, but he was a really good reader, and he discovered this book that he's absolutely passionate about, which had a very floppy sort of mass market cover called The Ginger Tree by Oswald Wind. And he talked to John Hatt and said, you must read this. And John said, yeah. And then he plugged on him every time he met him, said, have you read it? Have you read it? And eventually got it to the head of John's reading, and he fell totally in love with it. And it is one of those crossover books because it's one of the few books that have helped Eland make some money, because it sold over 700,000 copies after it was turned into I think a television adaptation. And it's that sort of insistence by our community of readers about things that sort of cross over. They're not actually sort of dead classic, straightforward, revered sort of pantheon that give Eland its sort of edge. I mean, that's a recent example, turning my back, of the things that we've published in the last 2 years would be we haven't got the contract for something, so I can't talk about.
Well, Moritz Thompson was quite a recent one, wasn't it?
Yes, that was Sarah Wheeler, a travel writer, championed Moritz Thompson's work. There was already Living Paul in the list. She said The Saddest Pleasure.
Oh, that's a fantastic book. Yeah,
the greatest contemporary travel books, and it was a passionate, I think, long, not so much review, but sort of literary piece in by Sarah that got me reading that. And then 3 pages later, you said, "This is absolutely made us." But that was sort of Sarah's role. Forgotten Kingdom, Peter Goulart. That was the one I was trying to remember recently. That was a reader, as I mentioned, saying you've got some really good Sinophile books on the list, but how come you missed that one? And again, I'd never read it, but rummaging around, found that I'd actually owned 2 copies, and bring them to the surface. And again, you switch immediately in. Sometimes I talk to my friends and my colleague, my wife, and say, I'd love a second opinion. And she always says, if you need a second opinion, don't publish it. It's got to be the absolute conviction that,
Yeah, that's something you said to me when we met a couple of years ago in London, that a second opinion means you want to protect yourself from something. I wrote that in my notebook. I look at that quite often. That's a very good advice.
That's that's very clever. Yes, I think there's some doubt, and you want someone else's opinion to.
Yeah, you're looking for a scapegoat to blame.
You are, or defend you. We've got 2 very politically minded daughters, and during lockdown we've had lots of discussions about whether the whole Eland list should be put on the scrap heap or the recycling list as sort of borrowing, orientalizing, sort of fictionalizing foreign cultures.
Yeah, well, that's interesting. This is something I wanted to ask you about. Like, what do you think about this current craze for finding something problematic about everything, like judging people from the past by the standards of today?
I mean, it amuses me because I think it's led by people who haven't read sufficiently to understand how rare good books are. And we comb through periods. And when half centuries can go by and there's no book that you particularly want to preserve from that time. But the acts of fluency and those people who can vividly describe and know a culture are so rare. You can't possibly pass them up. And I think it's very good to be reminded that we have possibly, and the next generation have enormously, improved the moral ground, but we need to know where we've come from. For instance, I'm looking at a fantastic book that I remember hating as a young man, which is Peter Fleming's Brazilian, and there is the N word in there, and I talked to my very, very sort of right-on daughters about that, and they said, "Give us the context." And then I read the description. They said, "Yeah, well, that's someone having a relationship with someone, and using a word we now consider inappropriate." But I would be unable to edit a text. I would hate. I think you either have to make a decision that you're going to publish. I would not be in favour of ever sort of bowdlerizing or fitting into our current needs a text. You either make that sort of commercial decision to publish or not to publish. We're very much against change, even to the extent that we've just working on an edition of Mary Wortley Montagu's Turkish Embassy Letters. And over the years, people have been adding letters that might have made it into the original edition, but didn't. And we're very keen to stay true to that sort of the commercial instant when a book had its readership and had its voice.
Yeah, I think that's important. It's a snapshot of a moment in time, and it's important to understand that people to recognize that people thought differently than we did in the past, and you can read through something and pick out what's valuable while also looking at something they've said and say, Jesus, I can't believe people believed that back then or thought this back then. Isn't it interesting how things have changed? And it's also wise to remember, that the people in the future will judge us as well. In the same way, it's quite smug to think otherwise, that some of our beliefs won't be judged just as harshly. And I hope they're as charitable towards us as, a careful reader would be towards writers of the past.
Absolutely. And that's where we slightly differ from the people we've always tried to find a sort of partner in America, and there isn't the same role of small independent publishers. There's a bigger, more difficult, more taxing commercial environment. But there are these amazing things called university presses, and we've tried to talk to them. And they are, the equivalent, I think, of the sort of indie publishing scene in London and Norwich and Edinburgh that exists in Britain. But they are committee bound with a form of earnestness, and I think it's good for us trying to sell our books and stay commercial rather than be leaning back on the resources of university press and so full of the sort of anxiety.
This is the problem. Yeah, if it causes you to compromise or requires that sort of compromise, it's certainly not worth it. I mean, even just the way people looked at others in the past, it's true of every culture. I mean, I don't mean that, not to say that something like racism is a deeply human trait, but casting the unknown as an other certainly is. Like how many people's name for themselves is the people. So the Inuit means the people, for example. So implying that everybody else is a barbarian who's not the people. I think every culture seems to have something that built-in inwardness, and travel is the cure for this. Contact with other people is the cure for this. So yeah, it's judging the past by cultural standards today is just it's to throw the baby out with the bathwater. I think we lose a lot by doing so.
It is indeed. But what is refreshing, returning to this, another book that we're just editing at the moment, so it's in my mind a lot, is Letters from Egypt by Lucy Duff Gordon, which is written at the turn of the 19th century. And that's fascinating to have someone who clearly is not a racist, but the whole world is, for the first time, becoming racist. As you've said, we're all used to every culture, others, whether it's Glasgow hating Edinburgh or Paris, Bordeaux never getting on, there's always otherness. If it's a New Guinea tribe waging war on its rivals, or Campbell's and the McDonald's fighting in Scotland, we're all used to that sort of antagonism of our neighbour. But clearly racism, as we know it, didn't exist much before 1850. And although we revere Charles Darwin and all, you get a very quick, extraordinary scientific mood coming. But we have these heroes who, even in this tidal wave of sort of, what appeared to be a science, stand their humanist ground and make you absolutely, in my case, worship the ground of Lucy Duff Gordon. And to realize things, Lucy is a representative of 3 generations of very well-educated feminist women making their own living, or certainly assisting their husbands in surviving by writing. And you've got 3 generations of women who all wrote half a dozen books in their life over the range of the 19th century. And again, that's rather wonderful to discover the richness of these different traditions. And we don't fit very neatly into patterns of, when women felt liberated, there were these exceptional individuals who got it earlier.
Speaking of that, I was listening to a podcast recently. I don't remember what it was, but the interviewee was a professor who had written a book about pilgrimage and travel as pilgrimage. And the host and her both agreed that travel writing is gendered, one of the current buzzwords. And the example they gave was 19th century travel writing. So people like Mary Kingsley and Isabella Bird, they said that because traveling was a masculine thing or seen as a male activity, these women were somehow exceptional. They were women being good at male things, and that's how they were regarded, not as writers, but as women doing male things. Do you think that's the case? Was travel writing gendered, and is writing about place still gendered today?
I think so much goes on and interweaves at the same time. What is interesting is the buying public. And if they want a sort of heroic male thing, that'll sell in its thousands. But these particular examples of Lucy Duff Gordon, mid-19th century, 1850s, 1860s, Mary Wortley Montagu, early 18th century, are absolutely at the top of the tree still in terms of writing, humanity, engagement in culture, and in both cases, really good linguistic skills, which gives live conversations with the Ottoman court and Turkish people, not just in Istanbul, with all the Levantine sort of ease going on, but in Edirne and other cities in Mary's case. And you have to say, well, this is right from the start of travel writing. Women were incredibly good at it. And what you notice in particular with both of them is they're much better at unburdening individuals, at recording conversations. And so you, by my standards, you have much better travel writing. And the men are, as men will do, more fixated by power, archaeology, great architecture, and sort of doing a sort of history summary of it. And those are still sort of vaguely upheld by the sort of gender issues. Dervla Murphy, one of our great travel writers, from my own conversation, I know she knows everything about architecture and archaeology and the history and incredibly deep reading in anthropology, but she doesn't bother bringing that in. And I think a male writer would possibly like to show off, or just sort of, perhaps not show off, just bring in that sort of horizon sort of cleverness of Renaissance man. Well, a woman will be more content to really get the sound box of a conversation and a dialogue with an individual.
It does seem like men are more interested in things as a rule anyway, like that, which draws people to things like engineering or mathematics, the professions that no sane person would enjoy doing. But the things that they cited as particularly masculine about these women travelers didn't strike me as so at all. Like, I mean, what they did was unusual, but all of this stuff was unusual. It's not quite a normal thing to want to, walk across the Sahara, for example, or go live in a hut with some tribe. I mean, they were unusual people in general. So someone like Beryl Markham comes to mind. Her wonderful book, West with the Night. she wasn't masculine. She was a pilot.
Yeah, I totally agree. Isabella Bird is a very interesting character because she would found traditional British society so destructive that she would go into illness and, famously fit and sort of capable of riding horses across the world and exploring jungles when she was abroad, and would go into some form of decline once back in Edinburgh, with the freedom of a cottage in Mull to give her sort of breath. And so there is a need to look at what the society was doing to her. But I think that's probably much more in common with all British travel writers, is the need to escape this very controlled, sort of Venn diagrammed, placing society in Britain, and finding the freedom to go abroad is certainly crosses genders at all generations. And we really do like to include the 16th century. We've got 500 years of travellers, and they are much more united as individuals in this theme than divided by either gender or class or age or education.
I think so. Yeah, that's something that's many of these writers seem to have in common. Like they were subversive or resistant to authority, which led them to lead unconventional lives, like you're saying, or to search for lives outside their own society. People that just didn't fit in at home, like a Richard Francis Burton or Sybil Bedford as well comes to mind. So do you think that's an essential characteristic of somebody who writes about place? Sort of that being driven from one's own society, or that urge to rebel against it?
It's more complex because they then settle down, and as you know, writing is going to take you 6 months sitting in a dark corner, and sometimes 5 years, and sometimes 10 years, in order to get the respect of the society that they fled from. And so, although writers, time and time again, Gavin Maxwell, tortured character, but he did in the end want the respect of his own people, but on his own terms. And so they had to travel with him. Wilfred Thesiger, another perfect example of someone who's so harrowed by the appalling nature of his prep school, that's sort of 7 to 13 period of British life, that really that was one of the sort of driving forces of all his life, is escaping those memories of Britain and proving himself as tough all over the world. But in the end, writing the books, getting them published by mainstream, Gavin Maxwell Longmans. Gavin drove everybody mad because he was a very, very difficult character, and would turn up to his publisher once a week to collect the royalties, and was a maverick. But he, in the end, he wanted the respect of home as well.
It's interesting. It's a symbiotic relationship, because you really can't have one without the other. Like, no matter how much you rebel against it and seek to have your own life, you still have to publish that work somewhere. You still have to bring it back and kind of sell it to the society that you fled from. That's very interesting. And
as you know, you have to work really hard, and you have to, throw away the first 3 books. And it's not, we are, again, in the sort of heyday of COVID, we've been offered books, 1 or 2 a day. People are doing things. Think at the end of their life, they might just sort of write down a memoir. These are extreme gifts of craftsmanship, creating a page that people want to turn. As we all know, one of the most tedious of all entertainments is listening to someone's traveling tales, or worse of all, their slides in the old days, or looking at their photograph albums. Hearing travelers is not high up on what we want to do with our sort of free time. So transmuting that sort of negative energy into something that delights us is an extremely rare gift.
Was it Paul Theroux that said, when somebody comes to you and says, "Oh, tell me, have you been to Morocco? Tell me about your trip to Morocco," really means, "Let me tell you about my trip to Morocco." Like, you're in for an hour of boredom.
Yeah, and I wrote in the early part of my life a guidebook to Morocco, and lots of those people said, "Oh, would you come to supper?" Lay out a map, and by and large, they had their own ideas very clearly, and you could never get them off. They'd invited you as a sort of so-called expert to sort of plot their holiday for them, which I was happy to do, get well fed, well dined. But it was very intriguing in the nature of the marketplace, which I'm always fascinated by, is that you could tell people anything everything about Morocco, but in the end, they've already got, without having been there, 2 or 3 things that they really need to investigate. And, the power of, the image of the Foreign Legion to witness the Sahara Desert would be one of those sort of, you can call it a trope. They really had to investigate that. They really wanted to see the Roman frontier, and they wanted to sort of tease around whether this was, part of our heritage, and whether the, Arabs had destroyed this great sort of corporate culture. All of these things, whatever you told them, they'd become giggling back. And to make money, being a publisher and being a writer, not very well paid. Such a lovely life. It would be very unfair if it was. But so I have done lots of tour guiding and lecturing, and easily match my income as a publisher in the heyday by taking trips to Morocco and Tunisia and the Sahara, Syria and Istanbul. And it was fascinating knowing that you really had to tell them the stories they were prepared to listen to, which were sort of prearranged, which makes it very interesting about the role of being a contemporary publisher of travel, about what the market wants to hear.
I mean, it's obvious that people have, they don't like having their preconceptions shaken up. Like they don't like to have to change their mind about things. But to go into travel with your mind already made up, it's defeats the purpose entirely. Like, what are you going to learn from that? You just reinforce what you already think about a place.
It's very curious, and a skill writer takes people happily, amuses them, charms them, is good company, delivers something of what the reader wants or feels that they need to understand, and then takes them off onto the horizon, that without sounding pompous, sort of educates them about sort of realities. And I think that is something vital about being the travel writer, being good company. You become very fond of page turning and where they're going to go now, and begin to accept things from someone that you like.
You definitely want you want to travel, whether literally or physically, with somebody who you'd like to travel with. Not somebody who's a miserable person who you can't stand to be around. That's for sure.
Yes.
Yeah, and many of the books on your list, the writers capture that as well. Yeah, there are a lot of people you think would be the kind of person you'd like to have a beer with in a random bar in some strange place.
And that's been one of the rewards, is having beers with Dervla Murphy. And it's like winning the pool is spending a couple of days with her. She has this enormous breakfast and has listened to the World Service broadcast, and the conversation starts right in the morning and carry on. Engaged, relevant, never showing off, always inquiring. And it's fantastic to meet someone who's possibly even better than she is on the page, because often dealing with writers can be disappointing. The best of them has been condensed, for your charm and education on the page, and sometimes they're not actually that sort of interesting in the flesh. But Dervla more than delivers this sort of really impressive, engaged, and also a real democrat. Everybody gets listened to. Everybody gets to. None of that sort of silent sort of A grading of I'm a successful writer and it's me to tell you. She's a proper citizen.
That must have been quite a momentous day to get her backlist onto the Eland list. Was that something that was already with Eland from the beginning? Was it something that you arranged during your tenure?
It happened during our tenure, but it happened like all good things by a marvelous confusion of chance incidents. Is that she had this fantastically close relationship with John Murray, who would do the first read, and the actual copy editing would be done by Diana, by his wife. So she really trusted their joint judgment, absolutely. And she had that marvelous chance incident of literally bumping into John Betjeman's wife in Delhi on a bicycle, read her first draft and said, trust me, I'm going to send this to my publisher, John Murray. So D'Urville never had to fuss around with agents and rejections. She'd got a passionate, already published writer physically taking the first copy of Full Tilt to the offices in Albemarle Street, and John Murray saying, yeah, and so it was just a very, very, very close, intimate connection. And she became a great friend of all the Murray family, would stay with them, sleep on their sofa. So she was not going to be taken away from that relationship at all, until the sad thing of when Murray got sold down the river to the great corporate culture, which was owned by incredibly ugly people who make bombs. Lagerdère, made a fortune for the Falklands War, selling rockets to both sides, that sort of thing. And she said, no, I can't be part of this big corporate culture. And she was very reluctant looking around. And fortunately, the publicist that we employed had worked with John Murray and said, well, why don't you meet Rose and Barnaby? So we knew that she didn't really like restaurants, hated sort of stylish, sort of first-class life. So we cooked a really big Irish breakfast in our home. And it wasn't going very well. D'Urville came in and said, no, I've eaten hours ago. And, so all the bacon and mushrooms that I prepared were looking like it was going to waste. But then suddenly, through our kitchen door, the door opened and in ran two daughters trying to herd our small collection of rabbits that lived in our back garden in London. And that just broke the ice. I mean, D'Urville became suddenly being very sort of hostile and suspicious of us, just decided this was the sort of people she wanted to be published by. So it was this escaping dwarfie, who was a tiny little rabbit, but incredibly energetic, who'd filled our tiny back garden in London with tunnels, was the medium that brought D'Urville and Murphy to Eland Books. And we got it by chance. And I still can't believe that Full Tilt had gone out of print, or that we got the rights not only to publish fresh 3 books, original titles by D'Urville, but picked up the whole of her backlist.
Was that out of print at the time? Sorry? Was it out of print at the time, Full Tilt and these other books?
So bizarre. And then I found that in theory it was in print in America, but it wasn't in print. So we reverted the rights there, and we've got. And it really gave us some additional commercial backbone, and was significant in strengthening the Eland brand and giving it this sort of very marvelous independent voice as well.
Such a good book. I just reread it recently. I'd forgotten how enjoyable that book is. It's prompted me to dig right back into all of her earliest works all over again. But one thing I really liked about Full Tilt is it's not an ordeal book, like the idea of going from Dublin to India by bicycle. So many people would just write that as this ordeal, this horrible slog. Look what I did. But the bicycle is sort of a means to an end. It's just the way of getting there, and it opens up all these conversations along the way.
She hasn't got an ounce of self-pity, and as you said, it's just all energy and enjoyment. And this is winter that other people would make into an expedition crossing the snow wastes of 63. You just have this Irish woman just bounding out of her life and getting excited by the world. I mean, the backstory is quite interesting, is that she had ended up nursing her bedridden mother. So literally she was a sort of Titan Spring who'd had her sort of youth of 20s very largely constrained by looking after lovingly, attentively, and she adored her mother. So when she did finally escape after her mother's death, she just could not be bored by anything, and that exuberance in that book is fantastic.
It really comes across in all of her work. So what's I guess it brings me to a larger question that we've touched on quite a lot already. But what do you think makes great writing about place? What does it take? We've talked a lot about what isn't in there as well.
I mean, ultimately, it's the ability to edit down, 5 years of experience into a couple of minutes of good conversation. And I've got a sort of standby rule that I never want to publish anything that I can do. I mean, I'm incredibly well-traveled in the Middle East and Sahara, and I want the books to be so much better than anything I could have done. And by that, I mean, I want a real intimate access into another culture, another community. I don't want my own sort of facile monument spotting and sort of arranged meetings with the local archaeologist and historian. That book is not good enough for me. I want those. There's a new term for it in anthropology. It's sort of chance encounters of just being able to talk to people, and somehow talk to enough people and have some experiences that make it like a sort of true insight. I'm always amazed how rare it is that anybody really gets a sort of friendship going on any travel. You have sort of encounters with taxi drivers and the restaurateurs and the odd madman. What's really precious is that sort of friendship, and that's a challenge, I think, for contemporary travel writers, is not to betray these friendships. You don't want someone going in there and sort of using people and stealing their stories. You want the sort of the proper sharing.
I mean, it also takes a lot of time, I think, and that's something that people don't seem as willing to put in anymore. Things have speeded up so much.
They've speeded up, and D'Urville is very strong. She is the sort of current saint of Eland thinking, and she is very against the culture of agents and advances, which seems to be such a good idea that an impoverished writer gets, in the old days, perhaps £20,000 to go off and spend 3 years writing. But in fact, it puts a time limit on it, a delivery deadline that's in the contract, and you go off and you manufacture your adventures. You actually don't have enough time to sort of boil it down. And John Hatt, who set up Eland, said, he's never interested in those sort of books that have got their mission, their time scale. It's already got their sort of narrative plotted out on a sort of billboard at home. He wants books that had to be written. You had an experience that really needs sharing. Either it was so shocking that you really need to sort of unburden yourself, or just so interesting and so life enhancing, you've got to share it. And that's what we look around, and the whole schedule of selling your project to a publisher, getting an advance, getting a word count, plotting it is against the creation of the books that we think are worthwhile. And I have served on some prize-giving committees, and there's some great writers out there, but you still feel again and again and again that people are cutting their cloth too tightly in terms of experience. And the books are good, but they're just not going to last.
That example of having that sort of experience that you just have to share, is that something that comes along only once? Like how does a writer even follow that up? Where with this pivotal thing that happens to you that you really need to capture, and that's your story, and that's the best of what you've got.
Well, the sadness is, John Hatt would again say again and again, is that most good writers have this one book, and if they're lucky, they've shaved it off into sort of 12 different facets, and perhaps had more than one book. But time and time again, there is, you can think of even novelists, going through one consistent sort of story that has to be excavated. Norman Lewis was very fortunate in being able to create, I think, 6, extraordinary sort of disparate classics from around the world. But that was, very, very rare to have that.
The other thing I find too with this sort of current trend on time pressure and advances, it seems to spark trends or phases. Like there'll be the ordeal book phase, and the travel to fix up a house phase, or the travel to fix myself. The travel as a subspecies of memoir. That's something you don't see in Eland's list. It's got a timelessness about it that's really enjoyable.
Well, on one level, we are vultures, just sort of picking over the bones of there's the real publishers are people grabbing and working on people's ideas and typescripts. We've got the much happier job of picking over and just selecting sort of one book from that sort of crop of 500, and the one that works and that comes out. And I'm really happy that all these things coexist, that there are fresh, exuberant, motorcycle diary books that come out that have got their great strength, and sort of, telly-friendly young men doing adventures in jungles with their shirts off. All power and all credit to them for giving themselves a life, and without exception, telling me things I didn't know before. But as you taste it, you realize this is just not going to last. You're sort of selling your telly self, which is not going to work for the next generation or even half generation.
Yeah, it lacks that timelessness, I think. And that's, well, I mean, to ask a rhetorical question, then why should someone planning a trip read something old rather than something new?
Well, I mean, I often wonder if our readers are coming back and they themselves have got really interested in a society. And so I often wonder if an Eland is good preparation for someone's travel, because I'm not alone in wanting to sort of experience it myself and not be sort of edited down by either a guide or a bus tour or all of those things repulse me. I want to have my own experience. I think having, for instance, somewhere like Istanbul, which I've gone to dozens of times and written 2 guidebooks and taken dozens and dozens of tours, private friends, groups, this, that, and the other. But after a bit, I'm so interested in it by now. I want to read more and more. But I don't think I did that much preparation before discovering it as a young man. And I've got a feeling that the enthusiastic Eland reader isn't someone plotting their great sort of 4-month trip across Central Asia. It's someone who's known or experienced the interest and the problems of being a foreigner abroad, of wanting to understand societies that you're not really ever included in. And that sort of odd coldness you get when you just know that you're never going to make it in this society as a local, however long you spend there. You're always going to be an outsider. And I think that sort of emotional reaction to the world, the challenge, the interest, but also the exclusion as well, sort of fortifies an Eland reader into being really interested in journeying into, in the company of Monica Connell, spending 3 years in a remote Nepalese village and getting to know as well as any outsider can the nature of sort of the female life in that community. But I think a lot of our readers have had some of that experience, and it gives them the taste for that sort of close focus.
Yeah, that makes sense to me as well. Like you go to a place that you have an unexpected experience or you find unexpectedly interesting, and now that you've scratched the surface, you want to dig deeper. But I think also, I know for me, when I look through your catalog, I see all these blank spaces on the map. I come across a book about a place. I think, Jesus, I know nothing about this place. And I'm immediately curious to find out a bit about it, a bit of what it's like. And I also consult, I write magazine features quite often and when I started this maybe 15 years ago, it was much easier to plan a trip online, in the sense that I could find information about places that was interesting to write about, or some little hidden corners of places, just by, combining search terms in a certain way, or getting very creative with research and digging down to page 10 or 12 of the Google search results. But now so much is dominated by commercialism and, Instagram and TripAdvisor reviews, that I find it's extremely hard to find anything that everybody else isn't already going to see. Like the superficial floats to the surface like a scum, almost, to not to be too elitist or anything, but I find going back to some of these older books, they reveal the sort of the cultural continuities of a place, like those aspects of character. It's like those aspects of character that you carry from childhood to old age, those elements that just don't change. And I find that's being alerted to those kind of cultural continuities and then interesting corners of a country that you might find in these sorts of books makes me want to go and see what they look like now. Like what's still the same, what's changed.
I'm totally with you there. And I'm just, as you were talking, I was just thinking of something that catches that. And that's sort of a funny book written by John Freely, who wrote a great guidebook very detailed, which then became a blue guide to Istanbul. And it's Istanbul sketches. And it won't help you plan, thank God, any trip and spoil an intimate community. But it's chance encounters and the mood of the city that makes you want to have your own. And that sort of, it's timeless. And also it's playing that very careful hand of not ruining, not making it a sort of has to get to sort of Machu Picchu sort of horror. I've, spent a lot of time traveling through France, which I adore, normally on the way to a North African country. And you need to understand France properly to understand half of what's happening in North Africa. And we've realized that any site in France with a 5 or 4 star sort of Michelin rating is totally sort of fucked over by international tourism. And but every village in France has got its own excitement and energy, and you just do your own wandering. And I'm an old student friend who we used to share a flat with and worked as a magazine book editor. We're doing our own version of a pilgrimage walk, making certain that we don't follow anybody else's walk. We're walking very slowly from Wells Cathedral to Canterbury. And both of us are monument nerds. We can't pass a bump or a village church we're going inside. And on the process of that, our last walk ended up in the ruins of a medieval Archbishop of Canterbury's palace that none of us had heard about, on the edge of a village in Kent. And it was just marvellous moment. You did feel, we felt like explorers, and it was just so sweet. This, instead of being turned into a historical monument with car parks and things, it was just lived in, almost like village housing, with someone writing a bomb on a corner and grilling something else. And you just had to pinch yourself that even in overexploited England, there's still magic waiting around the corner once you set off.
Yeah, that over commercialization can be overcome, right? Like the proliferation of something like The Lonely Planet seems to have done this. It starts off as an independent guidebook for cheap travelers, and then by the time I started traveling, in my late 20s, people are carrying this thing around and referring to it as the Bible. And you guarantee whatever places they highlight in the book, it's just going to be overrun with people coming to see the same things. But I found that by using the guidebook in reverse quite often, looking at the maps and comparing it to the places they talked up, and go to those other areas that they don't seem to be talking about, you could still get in touch with sort of that's those types of discoveries that you're able to make on your own. The stuff that nobody else has found yet, or probably nobody's interested if they showed up at these places. It ends up being very special to you because you met somebody there, had a coffee with somebody interesting, but they become sort of the landmarks in your own personal guidebook, so to speak.
Yeah, absolutely. And also there's, a friend who knows Turkey very well just said, even the most exploited classical site like Ephesus, turn up at 4 p.m. and everybody's carried back to their hotel for tea. And you can feel it, obviously not an explorer because you're buying ticket and saluting the custodian, but you can have it to yourself. And this friend who's lived all her life in Rhodes knows it very, very well, always goes there in November when the direct flights are over. And she said it's just like going back to her particular town, which is exploited disco bump throughout the summer. In November, it's back to one shop, one restaurant, and you can adapt by just going even slightly out of season or just at 4 p.m. And the world is not, even the most brittle places you can rediscover their enchantment. I
had that experience in Petra. I was with a photographer for a magazine story, and we hiked up to the high place of sacrifice, overlooking the ruins, and just sat there and waited until everybody disappeared. And there were just us and a couple guys with camels. By the time we got back down, we sat there after darkness and walked out of the Sikh with after darkness fell. It was an incredible experience, but it's night and day to what it was just 2 hours before. It just still had some of that magic there, despite how over photographed and how well visited a place like that is.
Absolutely. I did the same thing. And that slight sort of frisson of you leaving a little bit too late, and suddenly the landscape is empty, and a tiny sort of shiver of threat as the populated world diminishes. I'm very fortunate in my parents always encouraged us to go on night walks. And so the things that would be very normal and boring at 3 o'clock in the afternoon get transmuted with different scents and sounds if you go out at night. And it still is one of those things you can transmute the most boring suburb into a place of mystery where foxes cross over and the moon has power. I don't want anybody telling me that the world has been discovered or explored already. I know by just doing something a little bit different, you can turn even your immediate parish neighborhood into a place of enchantment if you've got the wit and the
the eyes to see it. And to come back also to the to this idea of old books telling you something about or revealing the present. Another one that came to mind while we were talking earlier was Warriors by Hanley. That's an incredible story. It took place during the Second World War, wasn't it? That's when he spent time in Somalia.
Absolutely, and as you know, records the people who'd been there before and the number of people who couldn't cope with it and who took their life, and a very, very tough environment when Somalia was quite well organized in terms of being ruled by distant imperial powers. But I think that book also prepares you for the excitement. Instead of thinking that Somalia is a failed state, you think, God, I'm beginning to understand just how tough this community is, and it's reverted to what it is. It's taking things around. It's that states are imposed, and we are all, waiting to naturally revert to our sort of anarchic tribalism of community life without being observed and taxed. He's not an Eland character, but one of my joys of the COVID lockdown is listening to my daughters and coming across James Scott, 2 Chairs for Anarchism, which is again turning the whole world's history upside down and just thinking, the world dark age is actually freedom, and the pharaonic ages that collapse into anarchy means that people are no longer being extorted and told to build mad tombs for tyrants and being taxed to extinction, and they got money to feed their own children. So there's so much that we need to constantly sort of bear in mind and contextualize.
The ending of one world is the opening up of somebody else's, I guess.
Yeah, and
one of the things that really struck me about Warriors as well when I read it, when I was a university student when the last Somali crisis was on, when the Americans were there and all this, and there were a lot of Somali refugees in Ottawa, and tribal fights were breaking out all the time from between members of these clans who were warring back home. And I remember at the time thinking, like, why the hell are these guys bringing the same problems that they just fled from into the place they just escaped to? Like, why would I didn't understand any of it until I read Warriors, and then it totally made sense to me. This fierce warrior culture. It's just reverting to type, I guess. It didn't matter where they were. These fundamental elements of their culture were there.
And isn't that fabulous discovery, realizing that beneath, this sort of late 20th, 21st century sad-looking refugee in his drab clothing in Ottawa displaced, actually, the real engaging PowerPoints of his culture are still intact there. I was rereading My Traitor's Heart, a book I'd love to have on the Eland list. Sadly, never will be able to. But it reminds you again of these Zulus not fighting each other's tribes, fighting within each other's clans. Wars would be ignited in the slave-like barracks of the mine workers. But, you don't know any of this until you properly take the hand of someone who can understand their culture, and suddenly it gets incredibly exciting. And this sort of grim-looking oppressed people becomes something completely different, sort of passionate, urgent, vital, energetic sense of loyalty to their own self. And that's one of, without sounding like some demented Orientalist always obsessed by tribes, it's wonderful to actually dig down so that you can really share some of the motivating sort of forces
it reveals something about our own civilization as well, how thin the veneer is of what we think of as civilization, our manners and all these things, and how deeply tribal our own societies are as well. I think it was in a 2005 piece for Slightly Foxed. You wrote that travel writing is always at its best when it is an individual's passionate response to a society. It seldom ever aspires to a balanced point of view. I think at the time you were writing about the death of Thesiger and Norman Lewis, but this the examples that you've just given speak to that as well. I think, like it's that journalistic sort of neutrality, that's bland kind of neutrality isn't there, but I don't think if it was there, you could understand these places as deeply.
Thank you for doing that. It sounds rather good, and I'm glad I wrote it. I feel that even more passionately now, and and feel excited about the role of this determinedly quirky, slightly uncommercial list, with this embedded zeal to wade past the sort of scum of international travel related, because as you and I know, I've done a lot of it over the years. Travel journalism is a deeply corrupt and influenced structure. We get free flights, we get upgrades, we get treated well, but we are basically salesmen selling holidays on behalf of travel agents, many of whom are close personal friends of mine, and I'm part of that world and deeply dyed by it. But it is, it's an industry well organized, and a good book, I'm afraid, can break through this really quite well constructed carapace of what you're going to be allowed to see and where you're going to spend your money, and get you somewhere that is so passionately and sort of alive, sensual, sexy, real, rather than sort of constantly look at that sort of bored, jaded international tourist who's just been shown things after another with no relationship, no sort of energy to it. And we are on a sort of mission to return to something vital and true.
Okay, if I could ask you about a couple more of those periods that you cover there, I think in that same Slightly Foxed interview, you said that the post-war period was one of the most productive eras for British travel writing. So why do you think that was? That's a period that I quite enjoy reading about as well.
Yeah, it is very interesting. Partly because we finally got good. Is we had socialism, you had Winston Churchill's much overlooked Deputy Prime Minister delivering everything that the Second World War was about, and this time getting it right. The First World War, all that sacrifice ended up in a chaos and confusion and a betrayal. But to a certain extent, Britain became good after the Second World War. We tried to have an ethical policy. The empire was slowly, and I think by and large, dismantled as peacefully as it could be contrived. And there was a mission and a sense of sort of renewed humanism and purpose behind Britain. And I think we were no longer empire making; we were unstitching it and trying to get at some truths. And Norman Lewis is classic one of that. But Wilfrid, in his way, although he was such a sort of arch sort of Etonian imperialist, his father was consul in Addis Ababa. As we know, his love was for the tribal communities that didn't want anything to do with the superpowers of the 20th century. And he was, in many ways, a deeply anarchic character. And so you get some a very rich mixture. And it's also very good for, American writers. When you think of Paul Bowles.
Yes, yeah.
I mean, these are not Orientalists plotting the destruction of Morocco and making it, sort of subservient ally of NATO. These are quirky, anarchic characters, off on their own, often driven by their own sensual needs or, the desire to escape corporate America. But they are fabulous. And, Paul Bowles is a great example of someone who didn't immerse himself in classical Arabic, learnt Maghrebi Arabic of the dialect of the Western Rif, helped young Moroccan writers translate, made oral recordings of musicians and storytellers. This is an amazingly unstitched sort of working anthropologist who dug himself and ended up dying. As Moritz Thompson, the world is full of strong Americans dominating and designing and involving the world, but there are comparatively few who get so embedded in the culture they're prepared to end up, happily plotting their graves in Morocco or Ecuador. And so these, deservedly are our heroes.
This is a true example of anthropology-lite, as you've often termed it. That deep engagement with the culture that doesn't. I mean, it overcomes what's inaccessible about anthropology. That was what I read at school, and all that obsession with kinship charts and consanguinity and all this. I don't know if anybody understood what any of that meant.
Famously tortured, sort of bad writing, sort of almost like some farcical extreme version. You think, God, is this ever designed to be read? Certainly not for pleasure.
But it's interesting though that you found a couple of actual anthropologists who can write accessible, funny books, like Nigel Barley's trilogy, Innocent Anthropologist trilogy. They were brilliant.
Yes, no, I mean, but he was very nearly sacked for writing well.
I can imagine.
And he's an edgy, very funny character, and he's sort of he survived really by the skin of his teeth. That book, it was really virtually got him expelled from the academy. But now, of course, he's delighted to find it's almost like a sort of set text, and anthropology, more than any other science realized it was, a child of colonial exploitation. It was a science looking at societies in order to govern them, at best to understand them, but normally to govern them, and sometimes manipulate the rivalries the better for foreign mining companies or imperial regimes to structure their power. And so modern anthropology is twisting itself in delightful sort of dances of trying to negate these great heroes who set it up and see where they're going now and for what purposes.
I like that he burst apart the pomposity of field work. I think it was, I got a quote here. It was in his the second book, A Plague of Caterpillars, where he talked about how in anthropology, enjoyment is often used as an approximate yardstick of understanding. So like if you don't like something that you've encountered among a people, it's ethnocentrism, but these people typically disapprove of everything in their own culture. So that and the idea, that the curious idea that everything miserable about a place is somehow more worthwhile, so the amounts of he says there's a tradition in anthropology that the amount of physical suffering of the researcher is a measure of the value of his data. And then, so he's been fed all this crap at school, and then he actually goes to this place. He goes to Cameroon and just finds out it's all just a great big lie. That's brilliant how he caricatures that.
He's also, trying his best to understand these cultures while realizing the marvelous sort of fraudulence of the whole sort of schema.
What I liked about the third one too was how at the end of the book he brings these guys from Indonesia back to London to put on exhibit, and we get to see the lens flipped around. I remember the scene they went for a walk and they came back and they said it's full of madmen, the park. But there was people walking around with dogs on the end of pieces of string. Like what the hell is going on here?
No, he's brilliant. I love the conclusion of that book. And examining all the failures of British society through the eyes of these skilled craftsmen making, isn't it, a grain storage hut in the British Museum? And that's where Nigel ended up actually working for the museum, collecting contemporary African ceramics instead of sort of history stuff, and had a very happy time. And whenever he comes to the office, tells me another outlandish but true story about the directors of the British Museum and their hobbies and their hauntings and their ghosts. I mean, he's an extraordinary character, highly productive, still writing, still busy.
That's good to hear. This is something I hope we'll see more of, this kind of flipping of the lens with people from other cultures then coming to travel within our culture and writing about what they've seen and encountered.
He does it so beautifully in that book because it is accidental, because he's determined to make, these, it's not a disposable culture, but he wants to, not buy it, but sort of build it and demonstrate their tremendous skills as craftsmen. So that was the project, and it accidentally allowed him to do that. But your memory of the Somali clans bringing their wars to Ottawa, I had a similar experience, rather naively, working as a volunteer after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan and working for the Afghanistan Support Committee. And I remember groups of Afghans coming back and showing tremendous lack of interest in British society, which was very refreshing, and going straight for a mosque used by Afghans and a restaurant. And you could see in a delightful way, just what we were talking about earlier. You need to have the frame of where you feel safe and what you know before you can begin to explore. And the place they revered much more than Westminster or Harrods or Buckingham Palace was BBC World Service, and that was always, if asked for a walk in London, they said, no, we'd really like to hear that. We've always listened to the Pashtun service. We'd love to see where that was coming from. And that was a rather wonderful moment of seeing London entirely through their eyes, getting rid of 99% of it and just concentrating on the sort of gateways that had relevance to a young Afghan.
Do you know of any books that do this sort of thing, like that are written from somebody not from a Western culture coming and traveling in the West?
Yes, we've been looking at them, and nothing is really. There's been some good work, some early translations of early Moroccan embassies to France and to London, and they've been published mostly in academic lists with lots of sort of textual scholarship. Nothing that really yet has sort of grabbed us as a self-sustaining narrative. Many of these people were writing reports. Obviously, it was their job to write reports on England for their court, who were always more interested in engineering and cannon foundries than democracy and freedom of speech. But yeah, it would be a good idea. We haven't yet found something that we don't want to patronize in any way. It's got to be as good as everything else.
I've recently picked up a book called An African in Greenland, but I haven't read it yet, so I can't say. I think that's still in print, though. About a guy who became just obsessed with Greenland. I think he walked there. He walked to Europe and then worked to earn enough money and then went to Greenland and wrote this book about what he saw. But I'll
tell us.
Yeah, I'll let you know if that's how that turns. I'll read that soon. One other thing that struck me is, as we were talking about the qualities that make a great writer on plays, like you said, not to dredge up your past too much here, but you, in an issue of Renegade, I think 2014, you mentioned that many of the great 20th century travel writers were autodidacts. So people like Chatwin, Petty Lee Fermer, Colin Thubron. So what do you think? What do you think this gave them that a more highly educated writer like a Robert Byron might miss?
It's very interesting that because they're driven. I mean, Deborah's another one who didn't, for the reason of looking after her mother, didn't go to university, and certainly university can sort of box you into received perceptions of what you need to do and prepares you for a wonderful life as a journalist or a civil servant, writing ever tighter digests of knowledge for a group of well-educated people. And perhaps not going to university means that the world is your audience. And I think there's something about university that condenses all the clever people from their schools and classrooms in your nation together, and you have a perception of the educated, I don't want to call them elite, but this minority who end up running everything as lawyers, accountants, MPs, this, what, the other. And a travel writer who hasn't touched or been tainted by that very sort of powerful, and in my case, delightful experience, has got this sort of still talking to the inhabitants of the bus, still chatting to people in the tube, still sort of engaged, hasn't become a sort of slightly, inevitably tainted by some sort of intellectual snobbery. And also that questing, they want to find things out in conversation. They don't want to, once you start becoming an academic, and even on a sort of humble little sort of undergraduate, ends up trusting the text and the professor in his chair more than anybody else. And, so you sort of deadening effect happens. I haven't really worked it out, but I have noted, Colin Thubron could have obviously, quite a sort of posh background. I think his father was a general, went to Eton, but he certainly wanted to get out there into life. And he didn't initially think of being a writer. He tried to make films, which is a very sort of democratic, open, sort of everyman sort of world. And it's carried on sort of driving him. Paddy Lee Fermer, famously, his university was his various elderly female lovers who sort of educated him on the pillow, as it were, or on the dance floor. And, quite rightly thought this is much more fun than getting bored in the back of the class.
I guess it lends a certain freshness, right? Like you don't come at the world with this sort of preconceived lens of how things are supposed to be, or slotted into these frameworks or lengthy timelines, the historical timelines, if you don't know anything about it in the first place. There seems to be an ability to reflect what's actually there rather than what you're. I find that also, though, the being an autodidact can also result in sort of some shoddy thinking, in the sense that, like, Henry Miller was often guilty of this. A writer I quite like. He was incredibly inventive at his best, but then at the same time, he would buy into just stuff that is absolute nonsense. Like astrology, or like they have pyramids in Egypt and pyramids in the New World. They must have been the same people. Where anyone who's studied it, even at a surface level, knows that it's different technologies that produce these things, and so you risk that bit of shoddy thinking, but at the same time, the freshness is really magical, I think, at times.
Yeah, no, I remember exactly that dialogue going on, and deciding in the end that I'm not sure we'd have got the rights to, but Henry Miller the thinking was too shoddy in the end, but so delightful, such energy, and that's it's always a very delicate balance, and I suppose this autodidact thing is what it gives the right sort of person is make some really good questioners and really good listeners, and gets that sort of oral live culture recorded, which is an act of genius to direct your conversation so it works in that way.
What was Martha Gellhorn's background?
Martha Gellhorn, very political, like a lot of writers. She came from St. Louis, right in that Midwest, and she had, I think, for her mother and father because they were real democratic activists. She had privileged access to the White House under the Roosevelts. And so she got to know some amazing people, and then was part of that writer scheme going down to witness on behalf of the president, who was deliberately sidestepping his civil service and even his staff in the White House, to have 30 young writers recording direct testimony of what was happening in the South and the Southwest in terms of deprivation of the people. And so it was a brilliant streak. And so she had this training, and we reprinted The Trouble I've Seen, which were her 4 fictional essays, very, very deeply rooted in that experience of recording the Depression. Mm. But that was an amazing sort of start to life. And literally, she lodged, in a spare bedroom in the White House. And there was a moment in some party where she had been shuffled forward, and Kennedy strode towards her, and she thought, "Oh God, what's going to happen?" And he just wanted to know about how the Roosevelts coped with privacy and basically getting girlfriends for both Eleanor and the president into the White House without anybody knowing. And Martha was able to tell her about the Roosevelts' close understanding with the garden staff and the back door and the doorman, and trusting people really with your life in terms of your status. But she was so funny, so earnest, such a sort of motivating citizen, but always available to see the absurdity behind any creed or even a great hero.
Yeah, I've never read that first book. I've just picked it up after reading Travels with Myself and Another. I can't believe it had taken me so long to get to this, but what an incredible book. I mean, there's another female travel writer who's there's nothing masculine about what she's doing. I mean, I quite like I enjoy the writing of Hemingway, but I mean, she was a much tougher traveler.
Tougher traveler. She was a blonde bombshell, and she used her looks. But she said, I must have been the worst lay in 5 continents. Only later, right at the end of her life, did she fall in love, I think, with a dentist on the edge of London who really gave her more fun under the sheets than all her famous sort of lovers and husbands. And she was a personal friend of John Hatt, who set up Eland. And she selected, in her old age, some young journalists like John Simpson and Nicholas Shakespeare and John Hatt, and made herself their sort of godmother, and didn't gather them together. It wasn't a salon. They used to have to report and drink whiskey with her in her flat in Chelsea, and she would just, overview what they were doing, encourage them, urge them on, and amazing. Final act in her life as a writer, of then working hard to encourage these sort of hand-picked group that she sort of presided over. And then when her brain and her body started to break up, she made a magnificent sort of ending of taking pills, leaving a note to her cleaner saying, "Do not enter this room. Ring this number. It's the doctor. I've taken my life." And everything was beautifully organized, and
Had really a life on her terms, huh?
Yeah, an extreme character. And one, yet another brilliant American who found that she couldn't really be at home in the United States.
Did you ever meet her?
No, never did, but have met quite a lot of people who have. And John Hatt is incredibly fond of her. And I normally spend a couple of days walking with John Hatt and just hear, very unstructured, and I'm sort of not quite a Boswell, but I'm just ready to listen for about 3 days as I hear, like I said, living connection with these characters.
Well, that's another one I wanted to ask you. Did you ever meet Ralph Bagnold?
No, I didn't. Recently went to the closest thing, I suppose, was his son had discovered some old rotting film, and the Royal Geographical Society in London had remade it, and we had a film screening in the RGS, and it was one of those wonderful London evenings where it brought together about 100 people, all either desert travellers or knew about Ralph Bagnold, or somehow drawn together to this silent movie, which on one level, because we run a small travellers film club in London.
Yeah, I was going to ask you if that's going to be back again now that the pandemic is kind of wrapping up as well.
Yeah, we just used as a friend kindly said, it's a bit like Dad's Army. You see Rose and I, this enormous Eland Corporation, these two slightly hassled, middle-aged, sort of plump people putting out chairs and screening films. But we love it for the chance assembly of what you get. We did one of our least attended films was an early Palestinian film shot with the help of the Syrian government. And we only had 8 people, but those 8 people knew so much about the film. So it ended up most wonderful sort of anarchic seminar about what's happening. But this one wasn't. But on one level, they looked absurd characters in their those sort of empire shorts and khaki hats. This was before the war, so it was a sort of very, very sort of young man, sort of 20s and 30s image. But there was a marvelous scene of them coming to have tea with these local clan in Sahara, and you thought, God, it must be rather wonderful. Like, being English was very identifiable, just as this clan had their own headgear and hats and sat in a different way. These sort of odd English types all had these shorts. It looked like a sort of tribal dress. You thought, I'm sure my children would strongly disapprove of their sort of imperial ambition, but they look rather sweetly identifiable and sort of, very modest people just drinking. Their idea of feast was, salt beef, cup of tea, and on a lucky day, open a can of sardines.
This Bagnold story was one that inspired me quite a lot. I ended up going to Waynats and seeing some of the places that they discovered out there, and the Salima Oasis where they stopped to water up, and before that last push across the sand sheets, and some of the rock art they saw at Waynat. I tracked down his memoir. Was it Sand, Wind, and War?
Yes.
I don't know how I got a copy. It was going for astronomical prices on eBay, but I was able to find a cheaper copy. But one of my desert friends actually liked his work so much that he picked up the physics of blown sand, which wasn't quite a successful read. I don't think he ever got through that.
On this screening, Ralph's son brought his dad's homemade compass and various bits of battered desert regalia. And Ryan, I mean, our footsteps must have often passed because after my father died, my mother wanted to go on an adventure. And so I would do an exploration of the Western Desert of Egypt every February, which brought 3 jeeps. And so we were also in the footsteps of you and Ralph Bagnold on those oases in the Western Desert, very much inspired by that book. And that sort of, that modesty. And I also took my older brother, who is a mining engineer in South America, and he's like a living version of Bagnold, unashamed about his sort of passionate interest in the working of internal combustion engine and survey equipment. And it was, again, the most sort of opulent treat you're going to give yourself is milky tea at sundown. You do feel in the footsteps and sharing, quite a lot with these heroes.
And the freedom still exists out there in some of those places. Like once you've gone a certain distance from the Nile, you plunge right back into that. You're away from everything.
Yeah.
I mean, but you're what I also like about it is that you're completely dependent on yourself, and your preparation. So anything can go wrong out there, but nobody's going to come and help you. But at the same time, you could do anything you want. You have complete freedom to explore. Yeah, what do you think will we be able to go back to these places anytime soon? This seems like such a mess at the moment.
Well, I'm a bit older than Ryan. I'm now 61, and I've spent my life exploring the Sahara from age 17. And you have to wait. There are moments now, for instance, you can go to Chad, where you couldn't have gone in my youth and middle age. The Sahara, thank God, it's never open. There's always problems and issues, either superpower politics or internal feuding. And so we just have to wait, and the doors open somewhere and they close somewhere else. The Iron Curtain was closed from my childhood, but now old Soviet Central Asia is incredibly open and welcoming. I don't think one can insist on seeing things. One just has to be lucky and take the good fortune of when things are accessible. And I've in COVID, because I thought quite rightly that Eland is a national and international resource, and various old customers isolated in their cottages, whether on the Isle of Colonsay or in Alberta, Canada, really, really love getting their Eland books. So we have been open every day and packing up and posting books around the world. So it felt sort of very, very valid, but also the delight in exploring London. And we've been walking on various old pilgrimage trails and old rivers out of London, and you really can get your adventure and your stimulus from anywhere. And the chance encounters, including walking in the Jewish quarter of North London, accidentally during Purim, having got myself lost. And then that's one of the secrets I must share with you. I think travel writers, by and large, get lost a lot, and instead of obediently following the map, all of my great adventures have been when I've actually got myself slightly bemused.
You don't encounter anything interesting by being found. That's the thing.
Yeah. So it's always lost moments. And it was wonderful being in Purim, where all the Orthodox Jewish community were out in their costumes, young boys dressed as royal guardsmen, or lots of Princess Cleopatras, quite a few Bedouin Arabs, very, very amusing encounter and full of charm.
So what's next for Eland? Can you give us any hint of what's in the pipeline?
Yes, as I've said, Ronald Wright, a fellow Canadian, he's a fantastic discovery, and he is up there with Norman Lewis and Dervla as a passionately, and Martha Gellhorn as a passionately engaged political citizen who's used travel writing to expose the truth. And Time Among the Mare, Cutstone and Crossroads.
I reviewed both of these on my blog. Yeah, excellent, really good books.
Oh, well, I'm glad you shared that. But that was a moment of high drama, and these were very recently on the Penguin Classic list. And again, you think, God, lucky in Eland to get writers of that quality. And then we managed to spot two of Charles Nichols, who's a fantastic literary detective, travel writer.
Did he write the one about Rimbaud in Africa?
Exactly. Brilliant. Because we've got that coming out literally.
Oh, that's a great book. Yeah.
The first copies have just arrived, and I'm wrapping them up shortly to send out review copies. And he's updated that. There's two other Rambo photographs that have since emerged. There's a whole sort of Rambo industry out there, and he's absolutely at the top of his tree. He's both a traveller, an academic, and also very amused. He's got lots of different experiences that make his books really quite exceptional. And so we've got two of those coming out. Borderlines, which is very sort of gung-ho young man's physical journey to Thailand and Burma, and somebody else, a much more reflective look at what Rambo was up to, losing himself. And for everybody who's writing brilliantly, there are people who just wanting to live. And as we know, Rambo had written brilliantly and just wanted a life of adventure without any sort of record. So it's a very sort of wonderful sleuthy book. And then I mentioned earlier in the interview, because there's so much in my head, these two really fantastic early classics by chance by women of the Turkish embassy letters, 18th century, Mary Wortley Montagu, writing with affection to people like Alexander Pope, to some of her ex-boyfriends, letters of charm and enchantment and discovery about Turkey. And Lucy Duff Gordon, letters from Egypt, where she's just preserving a life about to be extinguished by TB, living in the dryness of the Western Desert on the Nile. And just the last time a British person could be loved by an Egyptian Arab, because the shadows of our protectorate are already being assembled. And so it gives it, for me, a special energy of a love affair, of innocence, because I don't think, perhaps being Canadian in Egypt is okay, but being Britain, you feel, God,
There's a bit more baggage,
wading through, some bad deeds there in every sort of direction.
The Eland list is particularly strong on Morocco and Turkey. What is it about those places that has inspired so much great writing?
You're talking to one of Britain's leading Turkophiles and Morocophiles. Is basically, I'm passionate about both those countries. And if I knew other countries just as well, I would create thick as lists as those we've got. But they're places of mystery. They've got mountains, they've got culture, they are self-sufficient. They are ancient, intact Islamic societies that were never totally overwhelmed by Europeanization. So they've got that sort of mystique. And, the Ottoman Empire is tangibly part of Turkish culture. And Morocco's still got its Islamic dynasty descended from the Prophet Muhammad, who the same vizier who introduced the first French governor general was still alive, tottering on his staff when he bade farewell to the last one. It's an intact society in the same way like the Yemen. I think the Yemen has produced also great sort of libraries of people digging and trying to understand this incredibly contact and rich society that's still intact with its problems, like Somalia as well.
I was surprised at just how recently this sort of turbulent society existed in Morocco. Like I just went there for the first time a couple of years ago, and I read Walter Harris's book Morocco That Was. It's really not that long ago.
Yeah, no.
I mean, just the traces are everywhere. It's not what I expected. I expected a kind of a place overrun with tourism, and it's not what I found at all.
No, it's a marvelous country. And also, like all countries, it's not Morocco. You end up with these 5 very distinct regions. I mean, there are 3 indigenous languages in Morocco, 4th if you include, the far south of the Tuareg. And there are so many language, cultures, tribal identities. A great friend of mine who's a Moroccan who runs a academic journal was telling me more and more about his childhood in the Sahara, and absolutely on his heart saying there's no one in Morocco who doesn't know from which tribe they are. And every year the representative of the tribe will make a personal oath of loyalty to the ruling monarch of Morocco. So you've got other extraordinary passageways, plus Islamism, plus language, linguistic, and a backstory of these Almoravid, Almohad, Marinid dynasties, Sardian, that's just so exciting to my mind and sensibility. Tourism is just a little skim of suntan oil on the beach, and is, fortunately, as you've seen, has not interrupted this extraordinary rich culture.
No, it's heartening to know that these places still exist, despite the despite the creeping tentacles of modernity.
No, and there is the first English language book festival being developed as we speak in Marrakesh in November. A group of Moroccans and British expatriates and American teachers, and we've got a Moroccan female poet from Meknes. It's looking very exciting, and really nice sense of dialogue through the medium of English. I mean, Morocco basically was a francophone sort of cultured zone with bits of Spanish language in the north and far south.
That's an excellent reason to travel.
Yeah, no, I think I'm very excited by that. So, Marrakesh has become a bit like a sort of adopted element of the southern coast of France, with its sort of golf courses and its sort of apartments and beautifully tended gardens. And it can look a bit trashy, but if you concentrate on the spoken word and the markets and the Jemal Fana, it's very much a totally intact society.
That's still a magical place. In closing, I just want to I wanted to mention that listeners can buy the entire Eland library in one shot. Those lucky enough to live in the UK. What was the price for that?
It's just gone up. It's incredibly expensive, 1,700. But I have to say that everybody who's done it has really enjoyed owning the whole list. And we normally hand deliver them because I sometimes trust the post office. I'm getting quite good at wrapping up book parcels. This 18 months of COVID has turned me into a very skillful website book packager.
You're going to need a donkey or a camel or something to deliver that. That's quite a library.
It's 5 boxes, and we had such an enchanting email from the. It's a hardworking vet in Cumbria, in the mountain, the Highland district, the border of Scotland and England, and she ordered the whole library. And I felt like I was packing up the best thing about me as I wrapped up all of these books, and it's such a pleasure.
I think I saw some on your Instagram feed. There was a guy in Malaysia who donated the library to his public library.
Yes, no, that was very sweet. He ended up delivering to an address in Putney, and there was his secretary sort of forwarding things. I had no idea that actually he fell in love with them with the display in Waterstones, where they've got a lovely table full of Eland, and thought, I'm going to do the same thing. And another eccentric character is a German who had a big motorcycle in post-war Britain and went around helping build oil refineries for England, and now breeds Arab horses in Bavaria. And he's a great Eland supporter. And I was rather sad when he bought the whole library, because I thought, we're not going to be wrapping up parcels to Heinrich again. But fortunately, he keeps giving copies to friends and showing them off in his library. So I have these these orders coming in twice a year now. So, it's a marvelous way to conclude this talk, is that it really has become a cooperative of passionate readers, and it is not really a business, although my wife and I own 90% and there are no other shareholders apart from the founder, John Hatt. We operate, but it's got the spirit of a mad collective. I hope it continues that way.
It's a really magical. It's a fantastic list. I think you're doing a tremendous service by keeping these great books alive. Yeah, it's inspiring to know that you're out there doing this work. And thank you very much for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure, as always, to talk with you, and the perfect way, I think, to kick off this new podcast.
Well, let's open a bottle of wine when you're next passing through from Berlin to London.
Yes, that sounds good. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you very much, Barnaby.
A pleasure as always. Thanks, Ryan.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Personal Landscapes. If you like the podcast, please give it a rating on iTunes and subscribe through your favorite app. You can find links to today's podcast and more conversations on Books About Place at ryanmurdoch.com. You'll also find a donate button if you'd like to contribute to the costs of the show. All donations are greatly appreciated.